and many of which are posing huge global disturbances. The most dramatic of these is the greenhouse gas effect, certainly. The fact that through burning of coal, oil, and gas, we have now filled the atmosphere with carbon dioxide to a concentration that has not been seen on Earth for 3 million years. This is a very interesting graph which shows the CO2 concentration for the last 800,000 years. And it goes up and down through natural cycles that are timed to changes in the Earth's orbital cycles. When the Earth tilts a little bit more towards the sun in the northern hemisphere, when it's a little bit closer to the sun, when different aspects of the Earth's orbit change, this either warms or cools the planet slightly. When the planet warms a bit, the carbon dioxide in the deep ocean degasses from the ocean. Like putting Coca-Cola on a stove, the CO2 comes out. And when the CO2 enters the atmosphere, it amplifies the warming coming from the orbital cycle. So we have these periods up and down. It's warm when the CO2 is high, and it's cool, or ice age, when the CO2 is low. And this is the cycle of ice ages for the last 800,000 years, the period of the Pleistocene. But then, look what happened. We naturally came out of the ice age about 10,000 years ago, and there was a normal cycle until right here, the last blink of an eye. And then something happened. What happened? Of course, James Watt came along in 1776 and said, here's my steam engine. It was the most important invention in modern history. It changed the world fundamentally. All of a sudden, we could harness fossil energy. And 100 years after James Watt came Daimler and Benz and said, here is our automobile. Good idea. Here's an internal combustion engine. And then 50 years after that came the gas turbine. And we've been having fun ever since, because that's a lot of energy that we've been able to harness that has made the modern world economy. But look what it did. All of a sudden, the carbon dioxide didn't stabilize at this peak. It just shot vertically upward. We have now reached a level of CO2 that humanity has never seen before. Indeed, it predates the hominid species. It goes back 3 million years since we've been at this level. And the last time we were at this level, the sea level was about 10 meters higher than it is today. That's not so good for coastal cities. Do you know any coastal cities? You live in one, I live in one. We should think this is a serious problem. We keep pretending it's not a serious problem until the big storm comes. We had our superstorm Sandy in October, November 2012. These are the New York Police Department cars floating down 10th Street in Manhattan. It took a month to get the electricity back on in some places in what considers itself the leading city. This city forgot, by the way, that you shouldn't put backup generators in the basement of your hospitals. They had the backup generators in the basement. They flooded. We had to evacuate 7 major hospitals in the middle of a hurricane. This is just an illustration of how unready we are for these realities. This is a different manifestation of carbon use. This is Beijing. In January this year, the air was so thick with pollution that the best advice was do not breathe for the next week. It was breathing poison, basically. And the evidence is that the pollution in China is claiming about 5.5 years of life expectancy in the coal-intensive regions. This is drought in Sao Paulo. Brazil doesn't want to talk about the drought till after the World Cup is over. But there's a very serious drought underway. This is drought in Indonesia. This is drought in Istanbul. Earlier this year, I know there have been rains since, but I believe the water levels are still very low in the reservoirs of this city. Precipitation patterns are changing everywhere. Of course, in some places, massive storms, like in the Yangtze River, where we were last year. We weren't exactly in this location, but we were around during this massive flooding. And the tropical cyclone Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines last year, was the most powerful landfalling typhoon in measurement history. You'd think we'd start to take notice. This is a picture, by the way, of another of the planetary boundaries, a child swimming in an algal bloom off the coast of China, where all of the fertilizer of the Yellow River Basin flows into the coasts, and massive pollution taking place. I also use this as a poster of bad parenting. Do not put your child into an algal bloom, even with life preservers on his arms. Not a good idea. Now, I believe that part of the crisis in this region has an ecological base. Of course, geopolitics, ideology, easy availability of weapons, all play a role. But remember that Syria and Anatolia experienced repeated droughts during the last 15 years. Serious droughts that were most serious in Syria, actually. Almost the entire decade between 2000 and 2010 was drought. And this led to a massive loss of food security and internal shifts of population in Syria. And I believe that that was tinder for the explosion against the regime that came in early 2011. The dark thing about all of this is that we tend to amplify these crises, not diminish them. We almost never view crises as ecological crises, and we don't even see the poor before our eyes. We only see the poor after the violence starts. And then the violence is interpreted geopolitically. And then it's factored through the Pentagon as a place to bomb. It's not a very effective approach to these crises. And unfortunately, the devastation next door is unbelievable, and you're right in the midst of it, of course. It's horrifying. 160,000 people dead. And my view is that a military approach could never address these problems. And that the idea of regime change as some easy solution from the outside can never succeed. And that what we should be doing is addressing more fundamental issues, more fundamental even than politics, which is water, food security, economic development, jobs, and not turning crisis into war. But I noticed that the United States is, now the president's asking for another $500 million to train the military in Iraq. To my mind, this is just escalation. I think the United States should have understood by now we have no military business or no chance of success in achieving any bigger goals. And I would argue that sustainable development is a much more robust and serious approach to these problems. before they explode into massive war and violence. And so I believe that what we're talking about is not small business or side notes or something on the third tier of politics, but should be on the first tier of politics for global problem solving. Now, Turkey lives in a very risky zone ecologically. This is a Mediterranean climate that is highly vulnerable. And there are 2 points of vulnerability. And they are that this entire green basin of the Mediterranean, from North Africa and the southern Europe and Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean, is what in this climate classification, in the Kirkland-Geiger classification, is called a CS climate, a Mediterranean climate. That climate is under tremendous stress from global climate change. And the main challenge is not only warming, but drying. There's expected to be tremendous drying precisely in the Mediterranean basin. This is very frightening in my view. This is the cradle of civilization. It's based on wet winters, relatively dry and sunny summers, and the winters are becoming a lot less wet, and the summers are becoming a lot more dry. And this means that the agricultural base of this civilization of 10,000 years is under unprecedented stress. And the other reason why this region is so vulnerable is, of course, your southern neighborhood, which is what is called a VW climate, which is a steppes, grasslands, and desert climate to your south. And this is becoming even more destabilized. And so Turkey has to view climate change not as something to talk about in global contexts, but as something of fundamental significance for Turkey's own well-being, even in immediate years and decades, for geopolitical significance. And one of the things I believe Turkey has to say to the much bigger countries like the US and China is stop your irresponsible behavior. You will wreck our climate and you will wreck our stability, or our chance of stability, if you continue the carbon emissions at the scale that's being done. We're going to need a global agreement on this, as I'll talk about in a moment. But the fact is that it's the big players that are going to be decisive. We need cooperation to get there, but China and the US are going to be the 2 biggest determining forces for the fate of the planet. So far, they've not found a way to cooperate or to even gain any kind of self-control. And it's incumbent upon countries like Turkey to tell the big countries also, please stop for the sake of the whole world. This is just one study of many that you could find that look at the projected changes to the mid-century of rainfall during the winter months, and you can see the whole region is expected to suffer tremendous rainfall declines. And in the summer months, which is the lower picture on the left-hand side, you're in a zone of high predictable dry. Not good, especially as populations continue to soar in Syria, in Iraq, throughout the Arab world. It's a big problem. So, as Professor Ergader said in his remarks a few minutes ago, the world recognized these challenges in June 2012, on the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit. It was not a happy occasion, because in 2012, looking back at the 20 years after the Earth Summit, the report card was failure. In 1992, the world agreed on a climate change treaty. It agreed on a treaty on biodiversity. It agreed on a treaty of avoiding desertification. 20 years later, all 3 treaties are failures so far. They have not changed the direction of the planet. Wonderful words, I teach them every year. I like these treaties. They're well phrased, they're well negotiated, they're clear, they're to the point, but they're not being implemented. And that's why the idea in 2012 was to do something more, and that's what brings us here today. The do something more was not to leave the fate of humanity to a closed room of diplomats or to international law alone, even if that is important. It is to mobilize the world experts and the global public to say we have to change direction. And it is to put the concept of sustainable development as central. Again, sustainable development means a holistic approach that combines economic, social, and environmental objectives, not just growing GDP, which is every government's dream, but combining it with social fairness and environmental sustainability. That's the idea. And the most important decision that was taken in June 2012 was to adopt Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, that would be guideposts for the world in the coming years. So I'll quote President Kennedy again. 50 years ago, he was pursuing a treaty with the Soviet Union on banning nuclear tests. And the partial nuclear test ban treaty resulted. And as part of his campaign for that treaty, which was mainly to convince Americans that we should have a treaty with the Soviet Union, he talked about the importance of setting goals. And he said something that I believe is very correct for us. He said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So it's a kind of leadership approach. Create clear goals. Help people to understand what this is all about. Show that it's feasible to meet those goals. That can give hope, political support, and momentum to actually achieving these goals. This, I believe, is what we're trying to do. So the world is negotiating sustainable development goals now. Next year, there will be 3 important global negotiations. In July, a negotiation on international finance for development, how to be fair and sustainable in financing development. In September, choosing the sustainable development goals, and in December, agreeing on a new climate treaty. It's a big agenda. Are our political leaders up to it? Can we nudge them and push them? Take this seriously. And once the goals are there, what can we do in the universities, among leading companies, in think tanks, in laboratories, to show the technologies and the approaches that can really make a difference? Just after the Rio Plus 20 summit, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked me to help set up what brings us together today, a network on sustainable development problem solving. And the idea of that network is that universities around the world, in partnership with major companies and foundations, and with civic leaders in countries around the world, should take up the challenge of meeting sustainable development. How to change the water, the agriculture, the energy systems, the population dynamics in ways that make sense. How to ensure education reaches every child. How to ensure decent health and and a safe physical environment. These are enormously complicated challenges, and there is no easy way to get global cooperation on this. And so the idea is that a network of committed institutions, leading individuals, leading universities can make a difference. And that is the process that we have underway, and why I believe it's so important and exciting what we launch today. This network has already put forward a kind of plan for the SDGs to the General Assembly. What kind of goals? Ending poverty, promoting growth and jobs that are sustainable, education for all, social inclusion, health for all, resilient agriculture, sustainable cities, sustainable energy, meaning low carbon energy, preserving biodiversity and good governance. That's the list that we came up with in the SDSN. It looks like the global processes are moving just in this direction. I'm rather gratified by how the discussions are going. There is one more year to finalize the goals. Let me talk about one example, because Minister Kavranoglu mentioned it, because it is complicated, because we're working on, and I want Turkey to be a major part of that work. And that is what to do about the energy system. The problem, as I noted, is that the modern world economy has been built on coal, oil, and gas. And nothing's wrong with that from a historic consideration, except that along the way we discovered how dangerous these fossil fuels are when they're used to the scale that we're using them. And here's the basic story, ladies and gentlemen, in one graphic that I hope is helpful. On the vertical axis are the billions of tons of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere every year. The black line has been rising. It's doubled from 1980 to 2013, from 5 billion tons of carbon to 10 billion tons of carbon put into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuel. Now, to get carbon dioxide, if you remember your high school chemistry, CO2 has an atomic weight of 44, and oxygen has an atomic weight of 12. Carbon has an atomic weight of 12, excuse me. So to go from carbon to CO2, you multiply by 44/12. I'll give you an A, that's 3.667. So if you are 10 billion tons of carbon, that's 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide that we put into the air last year. The baseline trajectory, the business as usual, is this red line. Energy use is soaring. Emissions are soaring. Discoveries of oil shale and gas shale and deep sea oil and Arctic oil, they're soaring too. There's enough coal, oil, and gas to continue to expand tremendously for decades to come. There's so much coal, oil, and gas, we can absolutely wreck the planet with it. We won't run out before we wreck the planet. We have to decide not to use it all and to shift to low carbon energy. That has to be a decision. Nature's not going to decide it for us. We have to decide it. Now, what the scientists tell us is we should limit the temperature increase coming from the greenhouse effect to less than 2 degrees centigrade. In order to do that, our trajectory has to look like this blue line, not like the red line. Instead of carbon rising in emissions, we have to stop the rise of emissions now and start heading down to 0 later in this century. That's a tough thing to do, ladies and gentlemen. It means a deep transformation. We just can't go on mining coal, burning gas, burning oil to our heart's content. And so part of the goal of the SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, is to help every part of the world understand how to decarbonize, given its local potential and local political choices. I'm hoping that this is a core part of the agreement in Paris next December, a year from December, that the world's governments will agree that every part of the world should adopt a deep decarbonization pathway. And that the SDSN can then help governments to understand what that pathway might be. How could we actually achieve a 2-degree limit? Basically, and without going into detail, there are 3 things to do. First, energy efficiency. Get more per watt. Second, more per watt hour. Second, decarbonize electricity. Produce electricity without CO2 emissions. How can you do that? Well, the minister mentioned some of the ways. Hydropower is one, wind and solar energy, nuclear energy, or what's called carbon capture and sequestration. If you're going to use coal, you can't use it the current way. You have to capture the carbon dioxide at the power plant and put it somewhere safely underground geologically. The third pillar is to electrify the automobile fleet and the building sector to run automobiles on clean electricity rather than on carbon-emitting petroleum. It's a very big challenge. We have as one part of this network a project called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, DDPP, in which the 15 biggest emitting countries are each putting forward a modeling team to ask how their country, how the US, China, India, Germany, and so forth, can reduce carbon emissions along the line of that lower curve. I would like Turkey to join that project because it's the same goal as the minister just stated, but to put numbers to it. What could Turkey do with its hydropower, taking into account that water flow is going to be reduced in the coming decades, so the hydropower you have now is not going to be the hydropower you have in 25 years. This is very pertinent. Nuclear, what about carbon capture and sequestration here? What about tapping other renewable energy? There's plenty of sunshine around. There's plenty of wind power. How much can be tapped and in what terms? So these are questions that are part of the SDSN. Let me mention finally what I regard as some priorities for SDSN Turkey. Of course, it's being part of the world process very dynamically. There are a lot of wonderful, brilliant minds in this room and around this country that we want in the leadership of this global effort. This is the obvious point that I want to emphasize. I'd like this network also to help solve Turkey's sustainable development problems. What will the goals be for Turkey? It's not too early to start analyzing that question. In Australia, for example, the Australia SDSN has taken up the challenge of defining sustainable development goals for Australia. And I'll give you all the information of what the Australian group has done. It's been a brilliant exercise over the past year to say this is what our country needs in sustainable development. So it's been very useful. Second is to work with the global effort to prepare a deep decarbonization pathway for Turkey as part of the global effort. Third is to deepen Turkey's regional cooperation. It seems to me we have 2 units established, but maybe Istanbul can be hub for a 3rd regional network. One is for the Mediterranean basin, and Siena University has started to pull together a regional Mediterranean basin grouping, of course, of which the Turkey SDSN will participate. Second, for the Balkans, in Belgrade, the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development in Belgrade has started a Balkans region network, which Turkey should participate in. There will be a climate conference in Belgrade in November 1 and 2 that I hope representatives here will participate in. What about a regional grouping for this region? For universities in not only Turkey, but your neighboring countries. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Egypt. Might be good, complicated, but actually quite worthwhile. I do personally believe and really hope that Turkey, Iran, and Egypt regionally can help sort out the problems of this region. The U.S. can't do it. And it can't be done by war. And actually, if you think about it, those 3 countries, by the way, especially, well, all 3, but especially here and Iran, these are, all 3, ancient civilizations. In fact, Egypt invented bureaucracy, I have to tell you. The Ottoman Empire did not invent bureaucracy. Egypt was there about 3,000 years first. But Egypt, Turkey with the thousands of years civilization here, and Persia and Iran, figure it out, please, for the sake of the world. Because just blowing up Syria and Iraq is not going to solve any problems at all. And this is what's happening right now. Just a bloodbath. And the people in the middle of it are just complete pawns of proxy wars and political visions that make no sense. But I believe that the challenges that we're talking about today are regional challenges. Where's the food supply, the water supply, the energy supply, the jobs for young people? These transcend every political boundary. And it gives scope for regional cooperation. And I hope that universities can, in a way, depoliticize some of this and establish expert to expert the kind of dialogue and cooperation that can ultimately help to underpin peaceful solutions as well. Another priority is climate resiliency. The climate will change. Turkey's going to be vulnerable to this. Are there good, robust climate adaptation plans? What could we do about it? Next on my list is Turkey's participation in the global thematic groups of this project. We have 12 major thematic groups in health and education,